So we're back for the second part. This is about two vintage decks, and the first deck I want to talk about is an quite old school approach to Magic. It's kind of a hard control deck, and this was originally designed during the Mentor phase, so when Mentor and Gosh were both unrestricted, and there was a lot of Eldrazi played in the metagame as well. And originally this deck was designed as a Grixis control, but Red doesn't really offer any good answers to stuff like tokens, and it is absolutely horrifying to play it against Eldrazi because Cavern of Souls basically means your counter magic is going to be dead almost half of the time, and Red and Black don't really have any decent removal. Spot removal is quite bad against Eldrazi. You're always going to trade unfavorably. Unfavorable. I give up. You're not going to trade well against Eldrazi. Their Reality Smasher and Thought Knot Seer are horrifying, and they might even get to a point where they can dodge removal with what's this called? The Flickering Eldrazi, the one that costs 3. So the solution I came up with to this problem was Pernicious Deed. So I kicked out Red. Red wasn't as strong or important at this point, and I played Pernicious Deed and the Toxic Deluge. This is a current version of the deck. It doesn't play Toxic Deluge main deck, it's only in the sideboard because, well, Mentor is not really a factor anymore, and neither is Eldrazi, but it's still there, it's still pretty good Toxic Deluge. What Pernicious Deed does is well, it does basically everything. It deals with Oath, it deals with artifact mana bases. Some people played like Thought Cost with Seed of the Synod. Pernicious Deed is quite an old wording, so it catches all permanents except planeswalkers, basically. It doesn't say non-land, so if lands are artifacts, they get destroyed as well. So Pernicious Deed is even quite strong against something like Paradoxical Outcome, because you can just crack it for 0 and basically wreck up their whole mana base. But it's not... It's okay-ish against Eldrazi, but you have to get to like 4 or 5 mana before it becomes effective. However, what's good about Pernicious Deed in this matchup is you can cast it proactively, which means you're going to dodge Thought Knot Seer if you resolve Pernicious Deed before they cast Thought Knot Seer. And secondly, as finishers, this deck plays Taziggur and Gormak Angler, and not only do they survive a Pernicious Deed almost no matter how much mana you invest, but they're just like Pernicious Deed. You can cast them proactively and they block basically anything except Reality Smasher. If Eldrazi was still a real deck, I would probably play 2 Gormak Angler instead of the Taziggur, just because Gormak Angler is like... it's the only removal that doesn't trade unfavorably. What's with this word today? I can't pronounce it. Okay, so Gormak Angler is basically the only removal that's going to trade 1-on-1 against a Reality Smasher. And you can cast it before he actually has Reality Smasher, so it kind of dodges Thought Knot Seer sometimes. And because it's not targeted, you don't have to discard a card. So it's just a really big creature that survives Pernicious Deed, and it's usually 1 or 2 mana. It's usually quite cheap. Okay, so what are the strengths of the deck? The deck obviously plays a shit ton of counter spells. You can see here, let me count. 1, 5, 6, 7, and 4 plus days. 12 counter spells, and it plays a shit ton of draw. It's the usual preordained shell with Chase the Mind Sculptor. Back in the day played 3 gushes, now it just plays the 1 and the Painful Truth. But you're quite likely to outdraw most blue decks, and because you play a preordained shell, your draw is very stable. And you're not really wasting any slots, because against most decks you don't have any dead cards actually. Pernicious Deed is like, in the worst case it destroys some of their mana base. In the absolute worst case. And in the best case it deals with Oath, it can deal with cards like I don't even know. It just deals with basically all permanents in the format, and it's quite strong against mod as well. So you're equipped to deal with anything permanent based thanks to Pernicious Deed, and you're going to deal with most spell based strategies as well, because you're likely to play more disruption than them. You're likely to play at least as much draw as them, and Pernicious Dead is going to control the board quite effectively. So against spell-based strategies, this deck is really stable, and you're going to lose some games due to variance. Like you don't have the equivalent of just assembling Vault Key in the first 2 turns, or to cast a really fast Tinker and stuff like that. And they're going to lose some games thanks to variance because of this. But on average, you are ahead, and with some good play and across the tournament, you're going to end up favorably against most blue decks. So what is this deck really bad against? I already mentioned Eldrazi. Eldrazi is insanely strong against this deck. Mind Break Trap usually does nothing because he rarely ever plays 3 spells in a row. Mental Misstep is blanked, Flusterstorm is blanked, Daze almost blanked. Force of Will is useless as soon as he has Cavern of Souls. I mean, I guess you can counter like some Mana Source or Thorn or whatever they play. Now keep in mind, back then Thorn was played as a 4-off. So actually all you have is like Pernicious Deed and Toxic Deluge to interact with them, and it's just not enough. There's like no way you're going to win game 1. And the most troublesome cards are again Thought-Knot Seer, because they can remove your refs. They can remove Pernicious Deed, because occasionally you can play Pernicious Deed before they get Thought-Knot Seer, but usually they played on first or second turn, and you're just not that fast. So how do you deal with this problem? The most intuitive answer would be to play a lot of removal. And again, the issue is pointed, or rather target removal is really weak against Thought-Knot Seer, and quite weak, Reality Smasher, and quite weak against Thought-Knot Seer, because they usually can pick it off with Thought-Knot Seer. So what is the answer to this problem? The answer I came up with was, surprisingly, Baleful Strix. Baleful Strix is ridiculously easy to cast. First of all, it's a creature, so it's unaffected by Thorn of Amethyst. And I want you to keep in mind, this is from back in the day when the metagame was quite differently. I'm not playing this deck anymore, it's just to give you an idea of the thought process back then. So it's good against Thorn of Amethyst. You can put it on the battlefield quite quickly to dodge Thought-Knot Seer, and once it's on the battlefield, it's always going to trade 1-on-1 against other Eldrazi. So it can block Thought-Knot Seer, it can block Reality Smasher. Yeah, you're going to take 4 damage, but no matter what, you're probably going to take at least 5 damage from Reality Smasher in pretty much every single case. It doesn't even matter, like even if he drops it and attacks and then you have to bounce it with Chase, something like this, in reality you're probably always going to take damage from Reality Smasher. But at least this is a quite stable answer to the problem. And what's also good about Baleful Strix, unlike something like Germac Angler, when he has I remember, the card is called Eldrazi Displacer. So if he has Eldrazi Displacer and he wants to attack with, let's say, Reality Smasher or Thought-Knot, if he exiles Baleful Strix, you're going to draw a card out of it every single time, because it re-enters the battlefield. So even though it is a creature, it generates an advantage even when it can't block. So it's absolutely perfect to deal with Eldrazi. It's like, if you want to beat Eldrazi, you just play 4 Baleful Strix and you're pretty much set. And the second card I used to play, obviously it's no longer in the sideboard, was actually surprisingly Consuming Vapors. And Consuming Vapors, let me show you what the card does, because I'm sure many people don't know the card. So Consuming Vapors targets a player instead of a creature, which means Reality Smasher's passive won't trigger. And you don't target a specific card, which means even if he has Eldrazi Displacer, he has to sacrifice a permanent. He has to sacrifice a creature rather. So he can't flicker out specific Eldrazi's to dodge your removal. He's going to lose a creature no matter what. And it has lifelink, which again counters like the damage you're likely to take from Reality Smasher. So it's extremely specific, and I guess it doesn't dodge Thought-Knot here. But when it resolves, it's almost always GG. It gives you so much life to work with, and it trades for 2 cards. Also, what I did originally, this deck played like 15 lands, which means it wasn't as good against decks that played Sphere, Thorn, and stuff like that. So what I ended up doing was I included Strip Mine and 2 Wastelands. Now, what do these cards do? So your deck is quite good against spells it can counter, but what about spells it can't counter, or specifically lands? Actually, before I included Wasteland, I had a bunch of games I just lost because of Library of Alexandria. Because he's going to outdraw you every single time. And with Wasteland, you can actually prevent it from happening. Or cards like Bazaar of Baghdad. If you waste Bazaar, he just gets 1 activation, and then something like a Nihil Spellbomb or a Tormod's Crypt or a Leyline or something like that basically won you the dredge matchup, so it's even good in stuff like that. And the third card is Cavern of Souls, obviously, so something like a human deck or an Eldrazi deck that tries to dodge your counter spells with Cavern of Souls, you have an answer. It's not great, obviously, because he can cast it. He can play Cavern of Souls and immediately cast a card off of it. But you do have a solution. And what ended up happening was that Pernicious Deed is actually surprisingly strong as a mana denial as well. So Wasteland kind of complemented that. And with Pernicious Deed and Wasteland, you even have an effective mana denial strategy against blue decks. So Wasteland is never really dead. There's some argument to be made to board out 1 or maybe 2 even against some blue decks, but to be honest, I think it's still quite good, and I ended up playing a Crucible of Worlds. This is now a Excavator for quite obvious reasons, which can close out the game with Wasteland pretty fast. It's like a 3rd Planeswalker, or rather a 5th Planeswalker, because you play Baby Jace as well. So yeah, um, if you want to design a new deck, consider its strengths and try to balance out the weakness by finding an appropriate solution. And sometimes it can be quite hard to find solutions, but you just have to dig a little bit. You just have to go deep. I mean, Baleful Strix in Vintage is a horrifyingly bad card in 99% of the matchups and situations. It's just it's a 1/1. It doesn't apply any real pressure, not even on planeswalkers. It can be stolen with deck even. The 2 mana cycling is just unacceptably bad. It's horrifying actually. Most Vintage players probably don't even really know this card. So you have to dig quite deep sometimes, but honestly, if you manage to identify a weakness or a matchup you have some problem with, you will come up with a solution. And it's usually worth doing that, because if you just rely on your strengths, you're going to have bad matchups that you're just going to lose. This deck without Baleful Strix and Wasteland, it's impossible to beat the draws. It's just impossible. And just by adjusting and including these small creatures, you get to like a 50% matchup. It's quite impressive actually, and I tested this quite a bit. I don't have the data here anymore, but what I usually do is, when I try to fix a problem like this, I try to play the matchup over and over again online, and I keep stats of this. I keep records of pre-board matches and post-board matchups, and I sometimes even take notes about how often I draw Strix and the impact of it, stuff like that. So, last deck of the day. Paradox. If you remember from last episode, I talked quite deeply about the strength and weakness of paradoxical outcome decks. And believe me when I tell you, I have tested outcome lists a lot. Like seriously a lot. There's approximately, I don't even know, something between 50 and 20 different lists I actually tested and designed. And I refined most of these lists even to a point where I felt confident. So yeah, I do have quite a lot of experience with outcome. And actually, before I show you this, let me show you what the Americans play in this slot. And this is a deck I pulled from a website. It was a top 8 deck of a quite large event, but it didn't make it to top 4. So it's just top 8, and I've seen quite a lot of lists that look just like it. And when I first started playing Outcome, actually I played something quite similar. I think I usually didn't play Vault Key, but it's a small point. Never mind that. So, if you remember last time, I talked about the instability of the deck. Like, it has some really weird, really weak draws. It suffers a lot from variance. This deck just tries to compensate it first by playing Preordain and Ponder, which I said last time can work, but it's also weak in the same way the deck is generally weak against like Talia and stuff like that. And the second approach is to have these random wins with Tinker Blightsteel and Vault Key Tinker, and it plays Demonic, Vampiric to search for these cards, obviously. But again, really, what is the issue of the deck? First of all, it's like mana denial strategies, and this deck plays 13 lands, which is ridiculously low. And it can only do that because it plays Preordain, but the deck relies heavily on the draw to be smoothened out by Preordain. And if you get punished for casting Preordain with spheres and stuff like that, and the Wasteland on top of it, it gets really, really, really hard. And the deck has to play like... I'm missing Pithing Needle in this list, to be honest. Actually, I want to talk about the sideboard as well. But it just plays 2 Fragmentize, 2 Hercules, and 1 Island to deal with the Mud matchup. And I mean, this is unacceptable. With 13 lands main deck, this is not enough sideboard to deal with spheres at all. Like, not at all. You can't reliably beat Mud with this deck. So the second kind of thing, or I guess it's kind of the same. Mana denial is really the issue of this deck, and something like Null Rod, Stony Silence shuts down pretty much half of your mana base. If you consider Time Vault and Voltaic Key, it plays 12 mana sources that are artifacts and just 13 that are not artifacts. So if there's a Null Rod on the battlefield and you just have Hercules Recall to deal with it, it's so fucking hard. Or even a Deck Faden. Deck Faden is, by the way, insanely strong still. I don't know why people stopped playing it as much. I guess they felt like Deck Faden is not that viable without the absurd card advantage of Gosh along with it. But it's not true. It's still really strong. Or even, let's say, okay, this is actually quite funny. How is this deck going to win if there's a Gorilla Shaman on the battlefield? How? You can't cast Outcome. There is literally, even though you play tutors, there's literally not a single solution for a Gorilla Shaman. All you have is like Mr. Man Force. That's it. If a Gorilla Shaman resolves, you basically can't win. You can kind of try with Monastery Mentor, but honestly it's probably too slow. Or you have to wait until you find another artifact, cast it, and immediately cast Tinker Mage. Tinker rather. But it's it's ridiculous. Or let's say a deck plays like red and green and boards in 3 Ancient Grudges. What are you going to do? Also, Tinker, he plays Blightsteel Colossus without playing deck himself. If the opponent has Deck Faden in play, the deck completely falls apart. It's just so unreliable, honestly. It's really explosive because it has Preordain and all these fancy mana sources and for outcomes, but it's this is not the deck to play, honestly. And yeah, just briefly about the sideboard. So what I would expect from a list like that is at least 1 land. Yeah, that's fine, but to be honest, this needs to be a plains. At least 3 Fragmentize, probably 4. At least 2 Energy Flux. Hercules Recall is... I guess you can bounce and try to just go off with outcome the next turn, but you're not in control of the matchup. You just try to buy time with Hercules Recall and cross your fingers that you can pull off a win in the follow-up turn. It's just really bad. And what do you have against creatures? Like, let's say your opponent plays Kambal. What is your plan then? Tinker, I guess, maybe? Your own Kambal? Excellent. What about Talia? This deck doesn't have a solution to Talia at all. It's just, there's so many issues, and he's not trying to solve these issues with his sideboard. He plays Kambal, which is, to be honest, it's worthless. I guess usually when you're playing against blue, you want to board out Vault Key, but since this is an outcome deck, you're probably not going to do that. So, what do you even want to board out to board in Flusterstorm and Kambal? This is ridiculously bad. Guys, don't play Flusterstorm and Kambal and stuff like that sideboard. Your main deck should be at least 58 cards, should be valuable and strong against blue matchups. So don't board against decks you're already supposed to be strong against. Try to balance out your weakness. This is an example of how not to do what I'm trying to tell you in this episode. Okay, so let's look at my current outcome list. So, this is a red, green, blue outcome deck. Why these colors? First of all, deck Faden. As I told you before, outcome has a lot of weird draws, so to compensate for that, deck Faden smooths out your draw a lot. The deck struggles with mana denial, like for example opposing deck Fadens, and by stealing Moxen or stealing back your own Moxen even, you can smooth this out. It's like playing another two Trinket Mages actually, because they both do very similar things, as in they get you another Mox. And green is mostly there for the sideboard. Last time I introduced you to a blue-red list, and this list, for example, doesn't have a solution for Stony Silence, doesn't have a solution for Oath of Druids once it's on the battlefield. You can compensate for that with Nature's Claim, Seed of Primordium, but most importantly it's about Ancient Grudge. Ancient Grudge is amazing right now. It gives you 3 wins in the mirror matchup. It's almost as good as Gorilla Shaman, but much better in most other circumstances. It's amazing against Mud right now, because they play a limited amount of spheres, so you probably don't need Ingotur to get to 2 mana. And once you start casting Ancient Grudge, I think the second Ancient Grudge tends to win the game actually. And this combined with deck Faden means you already have a pretty decent Mud matchup main deck. And if you compare it to this Esper list I showed you before, the Esper list actually has only Tinker with Blightsteel Colossus or Vault Key to win this matchup. Otherwise it's virtually impossible to beat the matchup pre-board. And with this you can stabilize, you can buy time, or you can actually even control the game, because you play Mana Drain, Force of Will, stuff like that. Daze is actually surprisingly strong in the matchup as well. Don't ask me why, it just wins so many games. And another card I want to point out is Excavator. So if you compare this deck to the deck I showed you before, Keeper, this plays a lot more lands, 16 lands and 1 Wasteland and 1 Strip Mine as well. If you combine that with Ancient Grudge and deck Vaden, you have again a similar approach to mana denial as you had with the last deck I showed you with Pernicious Deed, but because you rely on some artifact mana as well, Pernicious Deed obviously won't work, so Ancient Grudge and deck are your substitutes. But they do quite similar things. So Ancient Grudge, to summarize, it's strong in the mirror, it's strong against most blue decks that rely on Tinker and fast mana, stuff like that. It's amazing against Mud, which you usually have trouble dealing with. And it's amazing against Nullrod. And Nullrod is usually terrifying, because you don't want to play like Repeal, stuff like that. So if Nullrod resolves, that's an issue. Stony Silence rarely sees any play, but unlike most other lists, you still have ways of dealing with it. So Ancient Grudge is really amazing in this deck, honestly. And 2 more cards I want to point out, which are quite funky. One of them is Ruriktar. People make fun of me for playing this card a lot, and I tell them, well, it's it's actually the best creature in the format, or maybe, I guess, Griselbrand is technically better, but you're not going to hardcast Griselbrand. I've tested this deck a lot. I've played it in, was it 1 tournament? Or I guess it was 1 tournament, but I went undefeated in Swiss, and this is my only win condition, and I never, ever, ever lost a game when I played Ruriktar and resolved it, ever. It's so strong. easily the best creature you can play in this slot. Originally I had Empty the Warrens in this slot, and it's so much better. Empty still gives you time, and once you start drawing your entire deck with outcome, I guess it doesn't matter that much with what you win. But Rurik Tar is just a lot more stable, as in you can just cast it off of like a Mana Vault or a Mana Crypt or a Lotus or Mana Train, and by itself it wins the game. And I have to take another break because I have a visitor, but I will talk about Sideboard in the last part.